Welcome to Connecting Communities, a podcast in Kalamazoo about people who are doing great things for the environment and the community. I am one of your hosts today, David Benak, and with us we have Mike Weis from Dropseed, Native Gardens, and Ecological Restoration.
Got it.
All right, yeah, I had to go through that a couple times to get that. And then we've got our other host today is Joe Byers.
Hello.
All right.
Welcome to everybody listening.
So as we're doing this, we probably should have done this one a month ago so we could get it out as people were putting their lawns to bed for the winter. But let's still get this in people's minds. So we're recording this at the beginning of November. Leaves are all down. City's going through its leaf pickup carnival, and people are blowing those leaves into the sidewalk. So wanted to have Mike on to talk about what are more sustainable ways to manage your yard for this year and then for going forward. So Mike, just tell us a little bit about what you do.
Okay. So I run a business specifically for it's landscaping, but for native gardens. And also the ecological restoration part is removing invasive species for the most part and other things like that. In terms of tidying up for the fall, I don't really have that many trees on my property yet, but I've never, even when I lived in Chicago and I had massive catalpa trees, and for anyone who knows a catalpa, they have incredible leaves, which makes our oaks look like we've got nothing underneath those trees. But anyways, I never ever bagged anything and put anything out for pickup. Usually I would leave a thin layer. I discovered early on that if I left all of the leaves in my garden, then it would smother quite a bit, especially of the younger plants. The younger plants can't handle that much smothering by the leaves. It dries them out. It's basically the same thing of what you do when you prep a garden and you put cardboard down and you're trying to kill off the existing vegetation. If you have really, really thick layers of leaves, that's essentially what you're doing. So I learned quickly that I couldn't leave all those catalpa leaves, and so I would gently rake a little bit off. I compost, but then again, those leaves fill that compost. I have like a large containers, 3 of them, and still that would feel pretty large. So I would kind of crush them down. They have one of these. What do you call, like a leaf blower, but it's the opposite, where it sucks it and then it composts it shreds it. That helped in terms of breaking down the biomass, but in a lot of ways you don't kind of want to do that if you don't have to, because that's where a lot of the overwintering insects are they're hanging out in there. They find little cozy spots so they can overwinter and survive the winter. They go dormant. But and then if you chop them up, the leaves, you're probably chopping up all these insects. So you might as well just put them out to the city, anyways. But so if you can, you could just keep as many as you can in your beds. Put the rest in your compost bins. If it's really overwhelming, then I would send some off to wherever the city does. I've never even followed what they do with that path.
Well, interestingly enough, I don't know about the city, but a lot of big cities, they just put them in the landfill, which is even worse than just letting them decompose on your property, because then they're emitting methane gas inside the landfills, which is even worse for our environment. So
in Kalamazoo, I don't know if the city composts all of them, but the city does have a contract with, can't remember the name of the company, but they're the ones who make Dairy Dew.
Oh, right. Yep.
Yep. So that a lot of the organic stuff that the city has like leaves ends up there and gets composted with
Oh,
them.
great.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
And then we buy it back at the garden store for
Right.
mulch.
You could, eliminate the middleman and create your own compost for that. That's what I prefer to do. Sometimes if as I mentioned, there's way too many leaves. So sometimes I'll bag it up and I'll save them near my compost bin. So as I'm, keep changing, adding like my food scraps to the compost bin and it's breaking down, then I have some more leaves to add to it. So yeah, I'm all about trying to keep whatever falls on my land, try to keep it there. I don't want anything hauled away. As I mentioned, but I don't want to smother my plants as well. So like in an oak savanna, what would happen is there would be a burn, and that's the reason kind of why they're burning in oak savannas is to clear away that leaf debris, and so that these other plants get a chance to photosynthesize and not get smothered. Also for other reasons, to keep invasive species down. So that's what happens in an oak savanna. In a different kind of natural environment, like a beech maple forest, for example, burns don't really typically occur in those systems, but the leaf structure in beech and maples is very thin. They break down a lot faster than oak leaves. So you really, because that's what people will say. Well, there's no one that is blowing the leaves out of the woods. In a way, they kind of are with the burns in oak savannas. So you don't want too much of a heavy duff building up. Also, that's going to change the composition of the soil in your garden. It's going to start adding more organic matter. Sometimes you want that, other times you don't. You don't really need, if you've considered the kinds of plants that you're adding to your garden, you've already decided that this is kind of dry, more nutrient poor, sandy soils. So you've put those kinds of plants in there. And then if you keep allowing all this organic matter to build up, you're changing that composition. You're switching it from what might be an oak barrens type of soil to something that's more resembles like a tallgrass prairie, and maybe you don't want that because that richer soil might then start to kind of change the roots of those plants that really need a lot of good drainage and really thin soils.
I've heard that if you have like too much organic matter for the plant, like you're saying, that the plants get leggy in terms of they get really tall and then fall over. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I try to stay away from that. And in Kalamazoo, for the most part, we're on the outwash glaciers, so our soil, we're basically on a big, kind of like a sand dune. If you ever go by an excavation site, this is kind of one of my favorite hobbies. When they're doing some work around town and they have a big construction site and they have a big hole, I'm always curious what the soil looks like, and it's always interesting to me. I mean, it's really no surprise either. It's like the first 3 inches, it's like a little dark soil, and then after that, it's pure sand that drops down. So we got really great drainage here. In Chicago, it was different. It was basically built on a wet prairie. The soils are really thick, and my gardens there would grow really tall, which was kind of a challenge because, as you mentioned, they get leggy, they flop over. I love the soil I work with here in Kalamazoo, even though everyone seems to curse it. But I think that's a holdover of, the conventional wisdom of gardening and horticulture. They try, those conventional nurseries want us to consider the soil to be, we want our soil to be medium soil because that's what all of these plants, they have basically generalists, right, of plants all meant for medium soils. They don't want to say, no, don't buy that because that's not going to work. So these plants for very thin soils like we have here, that's a whole nother ball game, right? Like if you put in butterfly milkweed, which is a very popular species, that's meant for really thin soils. And when I work with Chad at Hidden Savannah, I swear every year there's always someone that comes back and complains that their butterfly milkweeds all died. And his first question to them is like, well, tell me how you water. And he's like, well, like I do my lawn, I just leave the irrigation going every day. He's like, well, you basically drown them. Like that those kinds of plants are unique. They don't need that kind of resources. They don't need that much water. They don't need rich soils. It will rot the roots. So yeah. That's a long answer to your question.
No.
That's fascinating. I'm sitting here just thinking, geez, this is so interesting and, and wonderful.
So many things. So one of the things you mentioned, and we just kind of bounce all over the place, oak savannas.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a talk coming up tomorrow.
You're kind of a local expert.
Yeah, so people who are listening to this won't catch that.
You go all over the Midwest looking at them and walking your dogs through them. And, and showing us how beautiful they are.
But what is an oak savanna? What does that mean?
So I think people might be kind of surprised to, the whole idea of savanna, people think of the African savanna. And we have our own savannas in the Midwest, or I should say had them. They stretched from Texas all the way to Minnesota, right down the middle of America. It was essentially the transition zone of the tallgrass prairies of the West and the eastern forest, deciduous forest kind of met in the middle, created this ecotone. Ecologists will tell you the most biodiverse area of any natural community is where there's a transition zone where these communities clash. And that's where the oak savannas kind of had this thin range. It's called the Midwest oak savannas. There's other kinds of oak savannas out west. But ours are unique specifically to this band right down the middle of America. Anyways, it's not quite a prairie. It's not quite a forest. It's its own natural community. They were easily settled. So, if you can imagine as a European settler coming from the east, battling a thicket of thick forests and oak forest and maple forest, and then you arrive in Kalamazoo. Actually was kind of like the eastern edge of the range, and it's even mentioned in the 19th century land surveyors notes that Kalamazoo is wide enough for our wagons to drive through. So it was like noted that this is spacious, and that's because of this opened canopy forest but it's the reason why it's open is it was in the Native Americans steward the land that way. They wanted to keep the forest from closing in. If the forest closed in, then it would become an oak forest, which is not a terrible thing, but it doesn't come near the kind of biodiversity that you have in an oak savanna, where you still have enough sunlight for prairie plants to still grow in underneath a thin canopy of oak trees. So they used those plants for all sorts of, for food, for medicine, for cultural crafts. Also, the way they did that, they keep them open, was burning, intentionally burning. They've been burning these landscapes for like 10,000 years, right? And then the European colonists come in, and they like, this is a great settlement spot, and we're gonna take over here. And when the Native Americans were forced out, or even if they were allowed to stay, they were fined heavy fines if they started any fires. So once the fires stopped, the canopy closed in, and I thought this was something that kind of happened relatively recent, maybe mid 20th century, and then I came upon this quote from John Muir's book that was published in 1913, and he was already lamenting the death of the oak openings, and mentioned that like the farmers prevented the grass fires from happening, and immediately it closed in, and then you lost all that biodiversity. So there's not many of these places left. We have 3 main oak savanna types in Michigan, and 2 of the 3 are bur oak plains, which is the bur oaks that we were just talking about that you see in downtown West Edge Park and downtown Bronson Park. That was the bur oak plains. Those are completely, the whole system is considered extirpated, and there aren't any places to visit. And so there aren't many places left. There's a few high quality remnants. Allegan State Game Area has some areas. And then you get into Northwest Indiana. There's some really fantastic ones at the Indiana Dunes National Park. And then surprisingly, Chicago has a lot of really good ones as well. But that's all I know, because that's my whole life is just around that little kind of hug in the bottom of Lake Michigan. I haven't spent much time elsewhere in the range of the Midwest oak savannas. Yeah.
Yeah, the bur oak is such a just ridiculously majestic tree.
It is. Yeah. It's incredible. And you see those downtown, and it's just like, you want to give it a bow. This guy has witnessed so much, right? It's been existed before there was a Kalamazoo, and it's still hanging out in between like the street and the sidewalk, and it's just like completely covered in cement, and it's still just flourishing. And you have those terrible storms. Surprisingly, the oaks, they kind of shrug them off a bit. Yeah. We had a few. We lost a few last winter, but for the most part, when we have those terrible storms, they're like, no big deal. Those Norway maples really take a beating.
Those things are
all the maples. Yeah, the silver maples. I can't tell you how many maples came down with the extreme weather we had this spring in the Vine neighborhood.
Yeah,
it was just ridiculous.
Those are bad ideas of planting those in parkways. I think they planted those. It was kind of popular in the 70s and maybe 60s because they grow so fast. But whenever you see them in the wild, they're down in the muck. They're in like floodplains, and they look different there. They're like the branches are branched out. They look down in parkways. They're just like so weak. Yeah, and they're always dropping those massive limbs. They're really dangerous, but the oaks, they seem to do just fine. And they don't even buckle the sidewalks like the others do. No.
Yeah, so we're all big fans of Douglas Talmey and his book, The Nature of Oaks. Like, I already loved oaks, but reading that book, like, I just fell so much more deeply in love with oaks.
No.
So you both were talking about the bur oaks. I love the red oaks. Like, it reminds. So my grandparents lived on property that had a grove of black oaks in Matawan, and it was like real sandy sand dunes, like what you said before, and like the spiky leaves. I can remember like jumping in piles of leaves, and
that's awesome.
Of course, he always raked them, but he always kept stuff like on his property, like so. But I can remember raking lots of leaves as a kid.
I know. Think about that. Like growing up, I remember also raking a lot of leaves, but they were never. You never put them out for someone to take them away.
Right.
I guess what was even worse was you burned them, though, right? Like if everyone's burning them. Yeah. But I just remember there was just always a pile, like we just kind of. My dad just like, just put it underneath the willow tree in the back. And then you just left them there. You didn't really, all this extra work that we make for ourselves is like something that is just a rather a new conformity, I feel like.
Yeah. And the equipment that they use is, walking in my neighborhood during the week, like during the day, like you can't even concentrate because these leaf blowers are so loud
and I was thinking, the raking leaves serves like an ecological function as well. Because how often is a raked yard completely spotless?
Right.
The way a blown one is. So you have a few leaves left, and then the leaves or the rake just is a physical action and breaks up a lot of the leaves and leaves pieces behind.
Right.
So
Yeah.
It's not as clean, which is better for nature. Nature doesn't like to be clean.
Right. It's a lot quieter.
Yeah. So, for folks listening, I gave Dee, our producer, some links to a podcast that I recently watched. And up until this point, there hasn't really been like any studies on leaving the leaves. I mean, it's kind of been a thing for a long time. And so this group of people got together in Maryland and like actually did the studying. So they started out in urban lawns that always cart the leaves off and, really manicured places. They left leaves 1 year and the insects increased 80%, just 1 year.
Wow.
Yeah. And like all insects, like beetles, butterflies, moths, firefly larvae. 80%.
Wow.
Like I was shocked. I was like, wow.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
And then there was, the most recent, the UN report on biodiversity, they had of flying insects have plummeted 70% in the last 20 years. Yeah. Bird species are down 60% as well. So, but that's incredible. I mean, it could just be, it's habitat, right? There's many other things, of course, but I mean, why not start working on what we can and what we know, especially if you find out that there's, through research, that, oh my gosh, this is something I can do.
Yeah, I mean, 80%, that's just unbelievable.
Right.
I mean, when do you get 80% return when you're reaching
And
things?
so one of the things I just want to throw, insects, bugs, icky, right?
Right.
And so that's what people, I've been really into this topic lately about insects. And if we don't protect the habitat that creates this diversity of insect life, you know what survives? Cockroaches, silverfish,
Flies.
flies. And so there's a lot of research coming out now that having a more biodiverse insect community keeps those quote pest insects down.
Absolutely.
So leave the leaves and have fewer cockroaches and silverfish.
Right. Yeah, the balance. There's predator insects, and that keeps like some of the aphids, stuff like that, really kind of annoying things in check. I mean, you see that and throughout, the animal kingdom, right? When you start to remove stuff, you're like, uh-oh, how did we screw up this balance so much? Well, it was already in balance. Like you can't really start shifting and taking things out of it without causing a ripple effect. So, and then insects is such a difficult one because there's just so many different kinds. Yeah. So there's a lot that we just don't know. Yeah. That's why the Ptolemy's books are so fantastic because they really kind of, he does a great job of breaking it down for all of us to understand, and one of the biggest ones was when they did that study on chickadees, and they showed they kind of followed the reproduction of the chickadees, and it was just one clutch. It takes to raise the chicks. It takes 21 days rearing period. In that 21 days, they noticed that they needed tens of thousands of caterpillars to rear just this one little brood of this one species of birds. So that tells you we need so many caterpillars just for this to support these food webs. And think
about how small a chickadee is. Right?
Yeah, right. That's not a raven.
Right.
Yeah, you're right. So you need these hyperproductive plants that host these kinds of caterpillars. So that is kind of blew my mind when he does these kinds of connections, right? Then it's like, so then you feel like empowered, like, okay, I'm going to really pop in as many hyper-productive plants as I can, like he mentions, so I could get, the most out of my little tiny land that, because, there's just, the more you learn, the more you find out that there's all these other possibilities.
Yeah. I mean, host plants are so important, and what you were talking about. He actually names them keystone species, which are vital to habitat. Yeah.
And like one of the things that Talmy mentions, and you pointed this out, you go out in your yard, and we're so conditioned to have like perfect plants, right? Mm-hmm. Perfect plants are depressing because they're dead. I mean, there's no life. It's like, ginkgo trees are really cool. Because they've got a great story, evolutionary,
right.
but they don't belong here. They don't contribute to the ecosystem. I think there's one plant or insect that uses it. Yeah. But then you get an oak tree, and like a white oak, there's like 300 or something.
Like
500.
Like 550.
So you go out and you see those perfect leaves, and that's a failure, right?
Right.
That's death to everything in the ecosystem. Absolutely. You see your oak tree with all the leaves are pockmarked and chewed on. That's a win. That's a success.
Yes, absolutely. I know I have this hostas right by my back door. It's about the only plant that remained from the previous owner when I took over, and it's curious to look at it, and it's basically it's as ecological functional as like one of those like pink flamingos, you know? Yeah. It's like nothing is messing with that, although the deer do like it.
Deer eat them,
That's true. So maybe it's a foil for my other plants. Like, here, go for it, man.
So much we could go. Oh, and what you're we're talking about, like kind of the connections. One of the things that one of the first warning signs that was raised by agricultural experiment researchers when DDT first hit the market was people couldn't figure out why when they used DDT, the insect pressure got worse on their crops.
Oh, interesting.
Because what happened is the DDT, nukes pretty much everything, but the pest insects, the herbivore insects are so numerous that they just biologically overwhelm the pesticide. They've got their generations are so fast, their numbers, they just come up with the genetic overwhelm.
Wow.
But the predator insects, they're smaller in number, and the pesticide concentrated up. So it wiped out all the predator insects that were keeping the herbivorous insects in check when they used this pesticide.
Oh my gosh. See, there you go. Wow. I never heard that bit before about DDT. I remember hearing the story about Lori Ott from Milwaukee suburb collecting all of the dead robins and taking them to City Hall and throwing them on the mayor's desk, and like, we need to do something about this. This is what's happening. To think that we almost lost, a ubiquitous bird species of the robin to something like that is crazy. And think about everything else we lost to over hunting, what was it? The passenger pigeon. My friend Steve Cato loves to talk about that. He's like, I can't believe that. That's like saying like the mosquitoes, we wipe them out. Like, it's impossible to wipe out the passenger pigeon. There's so many of them.
Michigan actually played a role in getting DDT off the market. The final court case was a case in Wisconsin, but there was one going on in Michigan at the same time where the Department of Agriculture was going to spray DDT and I think it was a dieldrin for Japanese beetles in Berrien County. And there it was the environmental, I can't remember, it was a new environmental group, that one of the legal ones that had just formed, they took it on as their first case that they took on outside of outside of New York. And the the DNR joined them.
Wow.
Because what was happening was the spray was killing all of the fish in the fish hatcheries. Yeah. So the state ended up pausing the program, so the case didn't go through, but it was one that looked like it could have been the case that finalized it, but one just after in Wisconsin did.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's interesting.
It's amazing the more you get into it, like we've been saying, how everything is connected and how important it all is. And leaves are not litter.
Right. Yeah, right. I mean, there's a lot going on there. Like you said, when you notice all the pock marks on your oak leaves, so, and you don't even really notice it. Like, so I went out with an Audubon club one time, and they said it was during migration season, and they said, you know, I'm not a very good birder. I'm like, I'm not seeing as much. And like, well, look up at the tops of the oak trees specifically, and you'll just see them, like all these little birds just kind of like, you know, picking through, you know, in the barks and the leaves. And they know where all these little, these caterpillars are hiding out. And that was kind of fascinating to me, because it's like, I mean, I see the pock marks, like you said, in the leaves, but I never see where are these 534 different kind of caterpillars. And it's just so, you know, it's at a micro level. And so, you know, and I'm looking for, think about people who have absolutely, you know, completely nature blind, you know, they don't know all this, you know, these other worlds, just in just one tree, right? That is happening.
I mean, stuff is eating all of my stuff, but I'm not good at seeing the caterpillars either.
Yeah, right.
Like,
the only time I see them
down
is,
there looking, and even the monarchs, like, you know, something's eating my milkweed all the way down to the ribs, but I can't see what it is.
I agree. And all my friends show these awesome pictures of spicebush swallowtail. It's like, man, dude, I like look at it every day. I don't see that. It's like, a friend of mine's son he's really good at finding. He's a herpetologist, and you know, I walk in the same you know, preserves as he does on my own. Never see him. I went for a walk with him, and he's like, grabs a snake. I'm like, how the hell did you see it? You know, and they're every, you know, it's just interesting. It's like what you're looking for, and I'm like really into the plants, and so I'm really looking for all these plants. So, and you know, and you won't go out with a person who's really good at birding, and that's really fascinating. I feel like, and this like, you know, they're just the tiny little sound. It's incredible, you know. It's kind of cool being able to like really kind of focus on these things that are totally outside of yourself. I feel like that's kind of what we need mentally, especially the kind of world we're living through. And it really makes a big difference, you know, when you get out, you know, leave the digital world and you start paying attention to these things that, you know, aren't gonna, although they could upset you once you find out what we start talking into DDT and stuff like that. But still, there's still so much more out there that's so fascinating. It's just can blow your mind.
Yeah.
And there's also a lot. There was something I saw a couple years ago about the benefits of bird watching, especially if it's just common birds. And it actually has more like mental benefits or emotional benefits. And I think about it, to me, it's so peaceful and enjoyable. Just watch a nuthatch going up and down a tree, up and down. And, you know, and like you're talking about, where are all these insects? That nuthatch is getting between every little, you know, cranny and nook in that bark and getting all of them.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have hemlocks in our backyard, and the chickadees, well, they make such a lot of, you know, they have all these cool different calls. So immediately I'm like, okay, what are they up to? That's where I eat my breakfast. And it's so interesting what they're picking through. And it's like it's almost like they're talking to each other, and the other guys come around and they start picking around, and I have all this bird seed out, and they have no interest in what I got.
Yeah.
They have interest in what's going on in these hemlocks, and they find it's just so cool. And that's even like during the winter time too.
Yeah. So I have a huge catalpa in my backyard.
Oh, wow.
And the nut hatches up and down because like the bark is like thin enough for like the catalpa worms to like overwinter in there. So yeah, like
they're picking away.
yeah, and the chickadees and yeah.
That's great. Yep.
So I knew this would happen. We'd go so far off the rails.
Oh yeah, what were we talking about?
I think we were talking about yards.
Kill your lawn.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was listening to somebody talking about leaving the leaves, and he was talking about how have to acknowledge that there are drawbacks. And you're talking about you leave too many leaves on the lawn, and it's going to kill the lawn because it'll smother just like the cardboard.
Mm-hmm.
Well, is that all bad?
Right, yeah.
But yeah, so you don't have to leave all the leaves to create the ecological benefit. So it's
Absolutely, yeah. And I would say, especially if your garden is young, that's one of the first, when I finished doing a customer's yard, I created this management guide because there's just a lot of questions, and I forget that people have these kinds of questions. I've been doing it for so long, and so this this PDF has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, and because usually it happens where one of my customers have done something and the garden failed because of that. One of which was not only leaving the leaves isn't usually too much of a problem, although I do recommend just if you have a ton of oak leaves, maybe scraping a little bit off.
or like maples. Maples drop a ton of leaves.
Yeah, that's true. But they usually decompose fairly quick compared to the oaks. And or like a sycamore is basically like leather, man. That thing's not going anywhere.
In the front yard.
Yeah, but on a young garden that was just planted, that could really create some problems. And she actually blew. She didn't have any leaves that would fall onto this garden, but she figured it would be good for the garden, so she blew all of her neighbor's leaves into her bed. And I went back the next year in June, and I'm like, nothing's growing here. What happened? And I start looking, picking away, and I realized that there was like 8 inches of wet leaves. And it just overwhelmed them. And I didn't really think to tell like someone like, you don't do that. But they hear this idea that it's really good for the soil. It is, but there's also, not a young plant that was planted the previous fall, barely has any root structures, just trying to get its root down, and it's trying to photosynthesize. It's going to have a problem. It all depends on the system, right? So if you have a garden that's kind of modeled off after a prairie, and you have prairie kind of style plants in there, those plants are not used to leaves at all, right? So they're not gonna like a big thick layer of leaves. In a beech maple forest system, of course, that's fine. They figure out a way to poke through those spring ephemerals. It's just what they've evolved to do. They know how to push through that kind of debris. But it just all depends on the natural community that we're talking about and what their evolutionary practices were, really.
I think that's a really powerful point to make. If you try to mimic a natural system that would be native to that climate, to that soil, to that precipitation, then it's going to be designed to work together.
Absolutely.
Yeah, like you're saying, that the plants that would grow under maple trees, they're adapted to go through that leaf litter. The same, yeah. So it's
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot, and I've learned that a lot after I moved to Michigan and realized, like, so the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, that resource is incredible, and I've learned so much about the various natural communities of Michigan, and there's just so many different. Michigan's unique, really. I moved here from Illinois. Illinois is basically almost all prairie, a little bit of oak savanna, and then there's a little tiny corners here and there, but it's mostly prairie. As now all soy and corn. But so I learned about these natural communities through getting really nerdy with the MNFI websites and their books, and it's just incredibly fascinating to me. And so I started thinking about this in terms of gardening, and that's what my talk will be about tomorrow. Is not we kind of dumb down this idea of gardening because, again, I think it's kind of pushed on us from conventional horticultural gardening that it's just, full sun, part sun, moist, medium soils, and that's about it. I really like to look at what kind of a natural community I'm going to base my garden, my design community off of a natural community. Of course, we're not reconstructing this wild ecosystem that took thousands and thousands of years to create. But if you keep those kind of components together, like you said, it's just gonna be more sustainable. These plants are meant to be part of a community, not just random collection of parts from all over the world. That's when you get into all sorts of problems, and that's when people say, gardening's not for me. I have a brown thumb. Because, yeah, of course, when you're taking plants from all over the world and creating a garden, it's going to be really complicated. There's going to be all sorts of different kinds of pests you're dealing with, and you look at some of these conventional garden books, and it's like your head's spinning. It's like it's so complicated. If you keep the community together as close as possible, it's gonna start pulling itself together and sustaining, and it's also gonna look more natural. So you don't have to get as nerdy about it as I do, but just a general basic understanding is very helpful, I think.
I think one of the amazing things that you do with your designs and your gardens is you make native gardens palatable because they're so beautiful.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I try. It's one of the things when I first was thinking about starting this business, and I was walking around in Kalamazoo, and my wife was like, there's so many cool gardens in our neighborhood. He's like, man, if you just had some native plants in there, and it wouldn't take much. And then I started to think, well, we could just put the ones in there that people can recognize, and the ones that are not going to be really imposing, right? And so that's kind of was the beginning ideas of this adventure and being a business. I never wanted to start a business, but then I started thinking about it more in depth in terms of natural communities. And then the other extreme would be someone like Tyler, and he and I were putting together a plant list for in West Edge Park, and he had this crazy plant list because he's a brilliant botanist. He knows everything that needs to be a part of this system, right? And he's like, let me know what you think of this for a garden. And I'm like, Tyler, dude, like 60% of those plants are not even available in the nursery. It's like, yeah, these are awesome, right? This is an awesome species list. But like, what is available to us? What is even going to work well in a situation? Because again, we're taking inspiration from a basically wilderness, a natural community, and we're distilling it down into a garden setting. So that's abstract art in a lot of ways. We're abstracting that whole idea and then magnifying it, right? So I always say, like, look at this prairie, think of some of these elements, and then and then let's crank up the volume on the coolest parts of it, right? And then like the color and the drifts and the basically nabbing some ideas from some of these these garden landscape architects, but using native plants instead. Yeah.
Yeah, and that just what Joe was saying. My wife and I have done a native garden in our neighborhood, and with the park that we did, an adopt a park with the city, and that's one of the things we worked on, is because so many people think native plants have to be unattractive. Yeah, they have to be, too tall and too like sparse or whatever. And so it's really great to know that you can make a traditional looking garden and still use native plants.
Yeah. It's a matter of learning what's available and learning a lot about the plants and just how they socialize with others, really, and how they work with your soil, with your light conditions, but mostly with other plants, and creating these combinations. Once I started doing this is basically all I think about. That's all I read about. And so it's like I've just kind of gone down this rabbit hole every day, really. I'm always researching different kinds of plants. And the problem is that I'm finding is that there isn't really a template for any of this, That's another thing Tyler says, because I'm always bugging him about, like, what does this do? What is this like? He's like, man, you're asking me these questions, but that's a whole different kind of situation. Like, that's the natural world. You've created a novel system, and I don't know how that's going to work. And I'm like, damn, I'm not going to get the answers from him. And so it's kind of like play out over time. I don't even really have, people have been doing native gardens design for quite a while, but typically, it's all the same kinds, and most of them are modeled after prairies. And what I'm working with here, rarely do I have prairie type conditions, full sun, large areas where I could put really tall plants. I'm working in people's front yards, usually small gardens, and I'm trying to figure out ways where it's going to look really interesting and no one's going to complain about it, but it's still going to be like really have this ecological function throughout the growing season. So there's nothing for me to look towards to see what has worked. And I feel like every year I have to go back and look at what has done well and what hasn't. It's completely trial and error. I don't know how long this experiment's going to go on, probably for the rest of my life. I even asked, Steve Cato, he's our wise elder on this, and he's like, I don't know, I just throw it all in there because it's all going to change over time anyways. I'm like, man, that's not the answer I'm looking for. So it's I don't know, it's brave new world.
So when I was like 4 years ago starting to plan mine, like I listened to the Wild Ones episode that your presentation, like your mistakes and so I listened to everything. Like I included grasses, I had different textures, included shrubs, trees, all that kind of stuff to avoid those pitfalls. But I want the tall stuff. I want stuff that's 10 feet tall.
Yeah.
The pale Indian plantain that, gets, 7-8 feet tall and has great big huge blooms.
Right. Oh, that's a beautiful plant. I love it. Yeah, I know. I'm the same way. My garden in Chicago was crazy, but now I'm doing it for other people, right? So I'm just a little bit more sensitive to that. So I never thought about design when I did this stuff on my own or did it for my neighbors or my son's school. Like, just put in the most productive plants, let it go, like Steve was saying. And I'm completely fine with that. And I think, go ahead, go for it. But when I'm doing this for people who are paying me, and I just feel like, oh, okay, now I'm drawing upon my art side here, and I gotta like think about this more in terms of not just science but art, and how am I gonna make this work on both levels, aesthetically and ecologically. And we'll find out.
If somebody wanted to get started with a little bit of native planting there, so we're going into winter, so people got time to think about it. What could somebody do to start at a small scale in their yard?
Well, right now you could start by prepping it if you wanted to. You could put down cardboard and a layer of mulch on that, and just wait until that has everything underneath that is dead. In the meantime, you've got all winter to do some research, and there's tons. When I first started doing this in 2005, there wasn't like any information out there. Wild Ones had some stuff, but not that much. But now there's a lot of books. There's so much on YouTube, and people who have, those are kind of like the most helpful ones. What I learned, the way I learned, I feel like the most was going on garden tours with our local Wild Ones when I was in Chicago. And that gave me an idea of what's possible and what's going to work, and maybe what was a bad example of things I want to stay away from, and just taking mental notes from there. And then the other thing is it's always great, although I never did this until I started the business, is to create a plan. Even if it's just a little bit of a drawing, it doesn't have to be fancy. You don't have to use any sort of high-tech software. Just draw it out and get some ideas of what you would like for yourself. Like just basically be kind of selfish about it. Like, what do I really like? Like you mentioned, tall plants and pale Indian plantain. Yeah, like let's just go for that, right? And then figure out where you want to put them, figure out how many you need, and then you could create your plant list, the different kinds of species, and then how many you would need, so you are armed with a great shopping list when you go to Hidden Savannah on their opening day. So you're not just like what I did. We would go to, back then, the only time you can buy native plants was like they would have these Mother Day sales at like a nature center, and Possibility Place in Illinois would supply the plants, but they would only have certain amount, and you'd have to get there really early to make sure you got the selection. And of course, we always just woke up too late, and we just had bought what was left. And so I remember we got a lot of asters and goldenrod, so that's what we're going with. And then that that presentation that you mentioned, I talked about what a failure those early days were of that garden, because I just had all these imposing late season blooming plants, and nothing was going on for most of the year, and then it exploded in September, which looked great. But before that, there was you're trying to balance some blooms that happen from spring all the way through fall. That's going to make your garden look great, but that's what pollinators need throughout the year, flowering plants. Yeah.
Well, we could sit here and talk about this for like 3 more hours, but I was given the 5-minute signal.
Okay.
So
before you do that, one thing I want to just shout out to people: if you are listening and this conversation is interesting to you, there are some groups in town that would be good places to plug in and learn more and get involved, like the Wild Ones, Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones. We've mentioned that a few times. It's a good place, good resource, but also Reforest Vine, which Joe runs. They plant native trees and flowers and grasses and native plants in the vine, and they do that several times a year. So it's a good chance to learn how to do it as well as to do it. So,
And one of the best ways to support conservation is to financially support the groups that are already doing the work, like Southwest Michigan Land Conservancy and some of the other great places that are really doing the heavy lifting of restoring our ecosystems and making sure we have oak savannas for generations to come.
The Southwest Michigan Land Conservancies are
And volunteering for that.
Yeah, I've learned a ton from working on the stewardship volunteer crew with the Land Conservancy. They do incredible work. They're
Joe,
heroes.
you wanted to close us out?
Yes.
Otherwise, I'd let you do it, or we're going to get going.
Let's tell us where we can find you, your website, and whatever else, and you can plug anything else.
Yeah, and I have to take a look. It's dropseedgardens.com. I always think it's funny. I punch in my website and they said this page is not found because I always think it's Dropseed Native Gardens, but it's dropseedgardens.com. I had to just double check. And yeah, like David mentioned, Wild Ones. The Wild Ones chapter in Kalamazoo is fantastic, very active, monthly presentations. We also meet monthly at a bar. We call it Pints and Native Plants, and it's basically just a social group for plant nerds at Brewery Outre. I think it's the third Thursday of the month.
All right.
Well, thanks for joining us. This has been a blast. And we'll have to maybe do on-site with you in the spring when we get you doing some planting.
That'd be great.
All right.
Yeah, thanks again.
Yeah.
Thanks.